Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Autism and Girls. I'm Lizzie, and I'm going to be your trainer for today. So, given that today's online session is going to be a recording, you won't have the opportunity to ask questions of me directly, but what we have done for you is include some questions at the end that we think are really interesting, kind of helpful questions that we've received before when we've run this course with delegates. You will be able to request a copy of the slides that you're watching today directly from Mind if you would like to, but equally you can stop and start as we go along if you want to take notes about anything that I'm saying. So I actually work for an organisation called Aspie Trainers. We're delivering this training on behalf of Mind, and I thought it would be helpful to briefly explain who we are. So Aspie Trainers is actually a project. It's a project that was created back in 2014 to provide autistic adults with the opportunity to deliver training from their first person perspective. So in other words, real autistic people sharing their lived experience. That's actually quite unusual when you look across kind of the broader training that's available in the market today. The vast majority of autism training is not delivered or even co-produced with autistic individuals. So here at Aspie Trainers, we're really passionate that we're the people that are living it and breathing it. We are autistic, and some of us are autistic parents as well. So I have two sons that are autistic, age nearly 10 and 6. So we really can give you an insight into what it's like to live on a day-to-day basis with autism. The other thing about our project is that the vast majority of autistic adults today are not in paid employment, which is quite shocking when you think that roughly 60% of us don't have associated learning difficulties, but the recruitment stats for autistic adults are really, really poor. So the project is a great way for enabling people to build presentation skills, technical skills in terms of PowerPoint, communication skills in terms of answering questions and meeting people and traveling to venues back in the day when we did face-to-face training. So what we hope is that our autistic trainers will be able to go on and get other paid employment. And what we also do as part of the project is try and influence the services that are available to autistic adults in terms of education and training and mental health support, etc. So as I mentioned, I am an autistic mum to two autistic boys. I was late diagnosed, and I tell you that because it's actually very relevant to today's session, because one of the things that we'll be looking at as it relates to autism and girls is why that diagnosis is often missed or misdiagnosed. So I wasn't diagnosed until I was 42, about four years ago now. And one of the reasons why I love running this session in particular is I really want to try and make sure that no autistic young person, child or adolescent, has to go through and experience the things that I experienced as someone that grew up knowing and feeling very, very different, but not understanding why, and the impact that had on my self-esteem and my mental health. So what I hope by the end of the session that you're listening to today is that you will feel really confident to differentiate between autism in girls and autism in boys, and support the autistic young females in your life. Now, before we look at those specific objectives, I do just want to touch on terminology, because I'm very conscious that depending on the reading that you've done and the medical and education professionals that you come into contact with, and in terms of your own background, if you, for example, are autistic and received a diagnosis a long time ago, the language and the diagnostic criteria change and evolve over time. So if somebody was diagnosed in the UK with autism today, they would more than likely receive the diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. And that is an umbrella term that captures people who may previously have been diagnosed with Asperger's, so people with a very above average or high intellect, plus autistic presentation. It may represent somebody with autism and associated learning disabilities. In Aspie Trainers, we tend to talk about autistic spectrum condition or just autism. The reason we do that is within self-advocacy groups, we have quite a strong belief that autism is something that describes who we are. It's just to do with our different type of brain. We don't think it's something that we have or that we've acquired, and we don't see it as something negative, which unfortunately disorder does have some negative connotations. That said, it can be really tricky living as an autistic person, and for some autistic people, it can be very disabling. So the training that we run at Aspie Trainers is designed to be really inclusive. We're not going to try and convince you that autism is a superpower. Neither are we going to try and convince you that autism is something that's all doom and gloom and life is going to be really difficult and we want you to feel sorry for us. We just want you to come on the journey with us and understand how our brains work differently. So 2 of the particular terms that we will use in our training is neurotypical, or NT. That means somebody of the majority neurotype. So in other words, that most human beings are born with a typical brain that looks similar in those individuals, and that's neurotypical people. We then have this term neurodiversity, and this is a term that actually encapsulates a number of neurological differences. So autism can come under the neurodiversity banner, but also things like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, any of those neurological differences can come under the banner of neurodiversity. And people that engage with this kind of idea of neurodiversity are saying that when people, for example, have autism, it's not because something has gone wrong. It's not because that child has been born with a defect, or when they were growing in the womb, there was some kind of error in the cell division and therefore they're autistic. We believe that the autistic brain, the ADHD brain, is just a normal part of human evolution. It's a part of the way that genes evolve, and just another example of how humans vary. As I said, we come in all shapes and sizes, and different skin colors, different eye colors, and different brains, and that's what we very much believe at Aspie Trainers. So what are you going to focus on with me in this training? Well, first of all, I want you to be able to describe how girls on the autistic spectrum can present differently to boys. We're also going to look at the diagnostic challenges for girls, which unfortunately do lead to misdiagnosis and late diagnosis, as in my case. We're going to explain why girls on the autistic spectrum are more likely to mask their differences and how masking can impact mental health. And then we're going to explore some suggestions to empower and support your girls with autistic spectrum condition. And we will close, time allowing, with some sample questions that we've received running these sessions before to give you a bit of insight into some of the additional support that autistic females might need. So what you've got on the screen there is a list of 10 characteristics. And what we're doing here is we're deliberately stereotyping, okay? So as you look through that list, we have logical, aloof, sociable, interest in trains or sports, statistics, empathy, technical, interest in celebrities or animals, creative, unemotional, strong verbal skills. What I'd like you to do, just for like all of 20 seconds, is I want you to look down that list and just try and separate out in your brain which of those words do you think society typically associates with males, and which of those words do you think society typically associates with females? Okay, so I'll give you just a moment to read through that list and try and separate them off in your own head if you had to. So let's look at these terms then as they relate to gender behaviour stereotypes. And you'll see that the characteristics that are typically attributed to males are logical, unemotional, aloof, technical, and an interest in trains or sports statistics or some other kind of data-driven interest. By comparison, the characteristics that are more attributed to females are having empathy, being creative, strong verbal skills, being sociable, and an interest in celebrities or animals. If we then look to some of the key autistic diagnostic criteria, we have words like logical, unemotional, aloof, technical, and an interest in trains or sports statistics. So straight away, you can see very clearly that the diagnostic processes and criteria are very biased towards males. And that's because it was male scientists in the 1940s studying male individuals that identified autism and its presentation in these male subjects. So, and I'm going to go on to the next slide. There is this really clear parallel between autism characteristics as they're described in the diagnostic criteria and the more general male stereotype. Naturally, that means that it's much easier for clinicians to diagnose autism in males, and it's much easier for parents and teachers to identify and notice characteristics of autism in male children, because the stereotypical behaviour is represented in that diagnostic criteria. Autistic females, in comparison, our behaviour is often overlooked, and that's partly to do with the way that we're socialised. So when we have young boys, we almost always expect them to want to participate, for example, in team sports, and they will be encouraged to play football at lunchtime at schools, or their parents might take them to a football club at the weekend where they can practice and make friends. And therefore, quite quickly, if the young autistic male doesn't want to engage in those team activities, or maybe they are interested in the activity, but they struggle with the rules and the team kind of mindset, and struggle with how their peers are reacting in different scenarios, and maybe misinterpreting what's happening in the game, then immediately a flag is triggered and the parents are saying, hang on, there's something not quite what I expected here. And they dig a bit deeper. In comparison, girls tend to be, whilst I'm not saying that they're never encouraged to participate in team activities, it's much more accepted that girls often like to play alone, whether that's playing with their dollies and their prams and their dolls' houses, or if they're a great lover of reading novels, comics, or if they like sitting and drawing and creating stuff. It doesn't raise a warning flag if girls are like that. And therefore, it makes it harder for us to identify whether that more solitary behaviour is just because that's their preference, or actually because they're autistic and there's a strong driver behind why they feel more comfortable in their own company. The other thing is that when we look at the difference between male and female autistic individuals, female special interests, and you saw on that characteristic slide, they tend to be quite typical of the average female. So young autistic girls are, for the most part, interested in the same things as their peers. They like playing with dolls, they like fashion and makeup and celebrities, or they love animals and caring for animals. They might be into like ponies and want to do horse riding, all the kind of typical stuff that their peers are into. By comparison, males, quite often their special interest, the thing that they're really passionate about and hyper focus on, can be quite unusual compared to their peers. And if I think of my oldest son, Leo, as an example, he's probably one of the only boys at school that doesn't play football at lunchtime. His special interests have transitioned over the years. So he's been through, he was deeply obsessed with chickens and roosters when he was a toddler, and that went on for months and months and months. He had a very keen interest in the human body and could talk at length about different processes in the body, the digestive process, the process by which we breathe using our lungs. His kind of long-standing and kind of most dominating special interest is Transformers, so the robots that convert into vehicles and animals. And often that is the exclusive topic of his conversation. So naturally, that stood out at school from a very, very early point. But if you compare that to an autistic female who might show a higher degree of intensity or passion or rigidity around her focus on celebrities or fashion or dolls, but because it's a typical female interest, again, it doesn't raise any warning flags. Now, what you've probably noticed already on this training is that we're talking a lot about stereotypes, and I am generalising when I talk about males and females. And I'm doing that because a lot of that generalisation is true, and it's just a part of our society, and because stereotypes do exist. But what I do also want to flag with you is that increasingly today, gender is becoming much more fluid. And that's why I wanted to mention here about gender dysphoria. Some of you may be familiar with gender dysphoria. Some of you may not. So for those of you that aren't, quite simply, it's where an individual experiences distress because their biological sex, that which they were born with, differs from their gender identity, who they feel they are, and therefore who they want to be seen as. So when we're thinking about autistic females, you could have an autistic female who is assigned female at birth, but identifies very much as a man, and that's how they view themselves and feel about themselves and who they relate to. They may have been assigned female at birth, but actually they don't identify as a man or a woman. And typically this is called non-binary. So it's, or you may hear people talk about gender fluid. So this is somebody that identifies as a person, and maybe sometimes their characteristics and preferences may appear more feminine, and other times their characteristics and preferences may appear more masculine. But they don't strongly feel or gravitate towards either of the genders. Now, one of the reasons why it's important for you to understand about gender dysphoria is because research indicates that autistic people are more likely than the rest of the neurotypical population to experience gender dysphoria. The studies into this are still very new. We don't have a clear indication of why, but I do often get asked running this course, well, why do you think that is? Why do you think that autistic people will be more likely to experience gender dysphoria and kind of have different experiences of how they view gender? And honestly, I can only say my experience, but we're going to talk a lot about masking today, and this whole idea that autistic people grow up right the way through into adulthood. They have this instinctive reaction. They feel compelled to mirror and copy and camouflage to appear like their peers because they don't want anybody to realise that they're different. It's a survival instinct. It's a you know inside that you're not reacting the same way as other people. You don't feel the same way as other people. But until you have a diagnosis, or even when you do have a diagnosis, to fit in and integrate, it's often easier to adopt and mirror the behaviours and interests of those people around you. When you grow up doing that, as I did, your identity can become very confused, and it starts to get a bit blurry in terms of who I really am and what I like and what my preferences are versus what I'm learning about other people and their preferences and how they behave and how they adapt in different situations. So I therefore think that it's quite easy to imagine that through the process of masking and trying to understand who you are, that an autistic person would more naturally consider their gender identity, because you're questioning yourself all the time anyway. And I think part of that questioning probably in autistic people more easily leads to them thinking about, how do I identify in terms of gender? And do I feel like the label that I've been given actually describes who I am and how I want to come across? But that is just my personal opinion, and based on conversations I've had with the many autistic people that I've come into contact with. So this is just something I want you to bear in mind, because if you're ever dealing with a young person who you think may be autistic, it's worth having a little question mark in the back of your mind, to just look out for any signs that gender is something that they might be struggling with. Similarly, if you have a young person who starts to show tongue twister, starts to show signs of gender dysphoria, and you're having those kind of conversations, it's worth thinking in the back of your mind, do they demonstrate any other traits which might suggest that they could be autistic? But except, I mean, we don't know the extent of crossover. It's still worthy of a conversation and for you to think about. So, sorry, just cross my legs. So in terms of those gender differences then, we need to be able to appreciate why being female often leads to late diagnosis and what actually the impact of that is. So for myself, most of my life I was undiagnosed. I do kind of think of my life as being kind of pre-autism and post-autism. And if my son hadn't been diagnosed at age 6, my oldest son, as autistic, I probably would never have known. And that's quite shocking and horrifying to me, because my life has improved exponentially as a result of getting my autism diagnosis. And I often say to people, it's like someone suddenly gave me the rule book to my brain or the instruction manual and said, this is how your mind works, and this is why you think like this, and this is why you behave like this, and this is why you have meltdowns. And it's very liberating and empowering to suddenly understand how your brain works and why it works like that. Not having that information early on in your life as you're growing up, or even as a young adult, you do feel like there's something wrong with you. You feel that it's your fault that you're not like other people. You might feel like you're not worthy of other people's company, that you're not as important, that your preferences and opinions aren't valid. And often what happens is early on, autistic individuals develop mental health problems. Now, mental health as a topic is kind of much more visible and spoken about in today's society. But what we need to be aware of with autistic individuals is that because of the way that their brains are wired and their sensitivity to the environment around them and the way that they experience communication and conflict, lots of different things, but autistic people are much more likely to develop mental health problems. In the first instance, that's typically anxiety, which is one of the first things that we might notice in a young autistic person. And if they don't get the support early on to deal with those mental health problems, then it becomes a lifelong struggle. And I would never wish that struggle on anyone. I can track my mental health challenges. So in particular, my OCD and anxiety, starting around 4 or 5 years old, when I began to have lots of safety focused behaviours. I wouldn't be able to go to sleep at night unless I checked that all of the keys in the window locks were locked, and that I have 5 brothers, and I used to be really scared that they would stop breathing, and I would have to creep into their rooms and I'd put my finger under their nose to see if I could feel their breath, which is not normal behaviour for a 4 or 5-year-old, obviously. But as that kind of anxiety and need to try and control and protect people around me grew, my mental health problems just got worse. At 17, I went to the GP asking for help, crying, saying I thought I was mad. And they laughed at me and said, oh, young women, you're not mad. Mad people don't know they're mad. And they didn't mean it unkindly. They just thought it was ridiculous, I suppose, that there was this very distressed young woman who seemed intellectually capable, and obviously self-aware in terms of being able to recognise that I had some struggles. I just didn't take it seriously. And over the years, I kind of collected a whole menu of mental health diagnosis. So officially being diagnosed with OCD and anxiety, but also multiple periods of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then eventually, about 6 months after my autism diagnosis, I was diagnosed with bipolar 2, which is It's similar to bipolar 1, the type of bipolar that you may have seen in the media, but it's I have much more repetitive cycles of deep depression, and I don't experience mania. I have hypermania when I may become much more more proactive at reaching out to people. When I'm in hypermania, I have lots of very fast thoughts. I become quite impulsive in terms of suddenly deciding I want to move house, or I want to I've been talking to my husband about adoption, and I want to do everything now. But that happens to me few and far between, and it's much more likely that you'll find me in the dark dooms of depression. I can't get rid of that bipolar now. That's a lifelong diagnosis, but it is managed and it's manageable with medication and with therapy. I have a really brilliant psychologist working with me. Autistic young females don't need to get to that point. I was born autistic. I wasn't born with bipolar. And I guess that's why I'm being really honest and sharing that with you, is that you can protect your young women from developing these significant long-term mental health issues. The type of things that you also see in girls that you might not, that first of all, you might link as a mental health problem and not think of the driver behind it. So eating disorders are very common in autistic young women. Self-harming behaviours are very common in autistic young women. So if your daughter is engaging in that kind of activity, then it's definitely worth asking, what's the driver behind that? And does it go further than just body image? For example, could autism and neurodiversity be the driving force behind that? And then the other thing to call out on the slide there is that with women, with females, it's much more likely if we do go to the doctor and explain where we're struggling, even particularly with young teens, if you take them to the doctors and explain that they're struggling, maybe they're school refusing, or maybe you talk about the fact that they're having disordered eating, the doctor will much more likely link it to depression or anxiety because they're seen as more female disorders, and they won't think to dig deeper and ask where that behaviour is coming from, which is where you guys as parents and carers come in, because you do need to make yourselves the experts as it relates to the autistic brain, and play a role in, I suppose, yes, educating professionals, whether that is the GP or the school nurse, or whether that's the SENCO or the class teacher. But because autism in girls is still really underdiagnosed and not easily recognised, as parents, we need to be able to champion that and bring it to the forefront and share articles and, YouTube video logs that we've watched or books that we've read that we think are really, really good and that really highlight and explain what autism is like in females. We always get asked, Aspie Trainers, what the kind of stats are in terms of number of autistic people in the UK, and what's the gender split between males and females. And it's a really good question. To be perfectly honest with you, we haven't got a clue because the country doesn't have a clue. There's no national register of autistic people. And actually, given how tricky it is for adults to get a diagnosis, a lot of autistic adults who haven't been diagnosed early on will self-identify. So they will learn about and recognise and know to themselves that they are autistic, but they might not seek a formal diagnosis. So we don't have the data to make a sound decision. What we do know is that in recent years, the National Autistic Society has specifically looked at the individuals they come into contact with. And what they say is that in the schools that they run, they see one autistic female for every 4 male pupils with autism. What they also say is that in relation to their adult services for autistic adults, they see one autistic female for every 3 autistic males. So the figure that's often bandied around is 1 in 4. 25% of the autistic population is female, 75% is male. I truly and sincerely believe that in the not so distant future, we will realise that it's much more like 1 for 1. It's not a male dominated condition. That is just the effect of the fact that Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, when they did their initial studies looking at individuals with autistic characteristics, they were looking at males, and even right up until very late in his career, Hans Asperger still believed it was a male condition, and then he started to change his mind towards the end. This is why the clinicians are still working with very outdated male bias diagnostic criteria. And this is why you may find it much more difficult to get your female autistic girl a autism diagnosis, but also when you have males that don't present in the typical, because again, we're generalizing, aren't we? But not all males with autism present the same. Neither of my sons meet the kind of typical male phenotype. Leo, my oldest, is exceptionally gifted in terms of his academic capability. He's also really sociable. So, and he's quite gregarious. He loves performing. He's been in some amazing dance productions and plays. So he, whilst his social communication and interaction skills make navigating school life really tricky for him, and whilst he does have very intense special interests and quite rigid behaviours in terms of how he likes to live his life, there's a lot of the male diagnostic criteria that doesn't apply to him at all. And you do have to kind of put a bit of pressure on clinicians to broaden their perspective and further their reading so that they can more readily diagnose people who don't meet the very strict, rigid criteria. So I've covered a little bit of this already about kind of how the original case studies were done on males and that the diagnostic tests are heavily biased towards males. There are some studies that have suggested that autism is simply an exaggeration of normal gender differences. And therefore, because females in general tend to have more empathy and be more sociable than males, that's why autistic females can appear more sociable than their autistic male peers, and why they appear hyper empathic. So feeling very deeply empathy for other people's situations and problems to such an extent that it can be quite painful for them to be exposed to other people's distress or problems, because they almost feel like they're living it themselves and feel a huge sense of responsibility to try and resolve whatever the other person is going through. We do also see within the data that there are some genetic differences that mean that girls are potentially less likely to inherit autism from their parents than boys. We also know that women and girls are much better at masking or camouflaging, and because they do that with their difficulties, it's of course harder for parents, teachers, clinicians to recognise and eventually diagnose. And also because, and I'm generalising again here, so I apologise, but autistic boys tend to be much more disruptive in the classroom. Okay, they will may exhibit very strong sensory seeking behaviours due to weak proprioception. They may find it really hard to sit down. They're climbing and grabbing and jumping, and can actually create a lot of conflict around them because of their struggles with understanding social rules. Autistic girls, in comparison, tend to be much more quieter. They tend to get on with the work, even if they don't, not necessarily because they find the work easy. They might find the work really difficult, but they just tend to keep their head down and get on with it. They don't make a fuss. It's why, as parents of autistic females, you may find they're coming home and having these horrendous meltdowns and exhibiting real distress about who they are and how they feel about school. But school are feeding back to you that they're fine at school, they're happy, they're smiley, you know, they're a good student. And as a result, teachers don't tend to report autistic traits in girls because it's much trickier to see, to really properly see, whereas for the most part, for males, it's they find it harder to hide their behaviors and their impulses. They follow through in their impulses, whereas an autistic girl may think, oh god, I can't sit still, I want to get up, my legs are fidgety, but she doesn't get up because she knows that she's meant to be sitting there and sitting still and listening and being quiet, whereas an autistic boy is much more likely to follow through on the impulse. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about autistic behaviour based on my experience now, and you'll see this is a common theme as we go through the slides. We'll talk about some facts and then I'll talk about what that looked like for me growing up. Bearing in mind, I'm just one autistic person, so I'm representative of possibly some of the autistic females that you love and support, but definitely not all of them. So for me, I had a good vocabulary and strong verbal skills really early on. I think I was doing basic talking before I was even one, and could always, make myself heard and share my opinions quite forthrightly. I was hyper empathic to other people and animals. I often got teased because I cried really easily, and my youngest son is really like that as well. Like, you feel things really, really deeply. If an animal is injured, or it's why I became vegetarian so young. I think I was like 13 when I stopped eating meat and never gone back, because I watched a program on farming and some of the really horrible processes and things that animals have to live through, and it was just too much for me to bear, like the responsibility, and I had to, there and then, even though I enjoyed eating meat, I had to give it up. So that hyper empathy can be really quite all consuming. As I said, I did suffer from mental health problems from a young age, but nobody ever discussed that with me, and I wouldn't have known to raise it. I very much internalized and just dealt with all of the fear, the kind of state of fear that I lived in. In contrast to the male biased autism stereotype, I was really rubbish with numbers and technical systems. I still am. I wish that I could say that was one of the typical autistic traits that I enjoyed, but I don't. And at school, even though I was quite mercilessly bullied right up until like third year of high school, I really loved being at school. Because I was academic and I was hardworking and I was really well behaved, the teachers just seemed to really love me. I felt a lot of affection from them. Their praise and recognition meant the absolute world to me. I had a very difficult home life. So I suppose for me, maybe if I'd had a more typical, balanced, loving home life, then school wouldn't have felt like such a safe place for me, but school was my safe place. And I've, loved it, even though I was getting bullied. In terms of things like PE, I was really clumsy and uncoordinated. I highly suspect now that I have undiagnosed dyspraxia. I really struggle with my coordination, balance. I'm the only adult that I know actually that frequently falls over anywhere in front of people. It's deeply embarrassing. I've got more scars and bruises on me than a WWE wrestler, I think. But I was really clumsy and uncoordinated, but really willing. Like, I loved, and I still do, I really love exercise, but I just found trying to watch and mirror and copy what people were doing really, really difficult. I found it really hard to confide my feelings and fears to anyone. What I did do was write it in a diary. And I always say to people on this course, and also on the autism and adolescence course that I run, that journaling is a really, really helpful tool for your autistic young people. There can be different reasons why an autistic person doesn't talk about their feelings. So I personally think that a lot of my, because my fears were trauma-based, I just didn't feel allowed or able to talk about my true feelings. In my sons, I see very, very different behaviours. So my older boy, he's really articulate and he has the tools to explain his feelings really well. However, he tends to only really strongly identify like real excited, happy, manic joy, which he gets from his special interest or from intense physical activity like swimming or trampolining, running, or he feels really intense kind of anger and frustration if things go wrong or if his little brother's winding him up. And everything in between is all a bit shades of grey and hard for him to put a label on. And that makes it difficult to support him, because I see when he comes home from school, I can see on his lovely face that he's sometimes feeling overloaded or worried about something. But when I ask him, he'll just say, I'm fine, I'm fine. And it is hard for autistic people sometimes to be able to put to label the feelings and be able to describe. That can be due to something called alexithymia, which is a personality trait whereby people lack the ability to identify and sometimes to actually feel emotions. But alexithymia as a personality trait is the spectrum in itself. Yeah, it's far reaching, and you can have somebody that may have strong feelings but not be able to necessarily distinguish between them and what they mean. Or you might have somebody at the with alexithymia who just doesn't experience feelings in the same way as the rest of us. They just have a very balanced, static, cool state of being that isn't impacted by what's going on around them. The other thing that can impact autistic people being able to express how they feel is one of our senses, interoception, which is our sense of how we read our body's signals. So our interoception helps us know when we're hot or cold, or hungry or thirsty, when we're bored, for example. And it also helps us read our feelings. So if your autistic young female tends to show signs of being under-receptive to interoception, not noticing when she needs to go to the toilet until she's hopping on one leg, or having a huge coat and jumper on when it's boiling hot and you have to say to her, it's really hot out, you know, take the clothes off. What you can't do is force this. My other son, Henry, is also very articulate, and he wants to talk about everything. He's very deep. He feels things in a very intense way and is quite serious about it. If you laugh at him, woe betide you. He doesn't like anybody laughing at him. He doesn't like being shown pity. He wants to talk about everything. And when he'll come home from school, it's almost like a mini coaching conversation where he wants to unpick situations he hasn't understood, facial expressions he's seen on teachers, or conversations with friends that have upset him, but maybe just because he didn't read it properly, he takes things very literally. So you can start to see, whilst I don't have a daughter, I have boys, but you can start to understand the range of ability that an autistic person, an autistic female, might have to communicate her feelings. So if she can talk, fantastic, you know, leverage that, because they need someone to confide in. If they can't, or they don't want to, then something like journaling or using art, creative expression to get across how they're feeling is really, really cathartic and will help minimize them developing mental health problems. For me, my sensory needs and kind of behaviours linked to sensory needs got worse during puberty. I think puberty is tricky for any young person, right? But I think for autistic females in particular, because we do have a lot more bodily changes, you know, growing breasts, starting periods, those things can feel really, we lose control, right? Autistic people like to have control over what's happening to them. And when your body's suddenly changing, and that change can happen as early as 8 or as late as 15. I didn't go through any sort of changes until I was 15. But particularly for those young females that start earlier with puberty, it can be really, really distressing and disempowering. So as parents, we need to try and think about how to educate them in such a way that they appreciate the journey and the evolving nature, and how exciting it is that they're you know, growing towards becoming a female adult and what that means for them. The other thing that I did suffer with, and that is very common in autistic young people, is night terrors, like bad dreams. Even now, I'm still plagued with night terrors. As a result, my quality of sleep is really poor, and that did have an impact on me being able to stay awake in class. I know that sounds crazy, but if ever I had to just sit and listen to the teacher talking and like making notes, and this happened to me at work as well. I worked in corporate HR for many years, and having to like sit and take notes in a recruitment interview or a disciplinary hearing, or having to sit and just listen on a conference call, I could fall asleep within seconds, literally. What I realise now is that I was experiencing extreme sensory overload at school and at work. And when I got that opportunity to sit and not have to do anything, my body was just shutting down. My brain was saying, enough, she needs a break. And that's what was happening. And that is what may happen in your autistic young women as well. When you're looking to secure a diagnosis, it comes down to that thing, I don't know if anybody's ever said this to you or any of your autistic young people, but it frustrates me when I hear we're all a little bit autistic, aren't we? Or we're all on the autistic spectrum, because no, we're not. And the things that I'm describing, anyone can experience. These are traits of a human being, first and foremost. I'm a human being above, and then I'm a female human being, and then I'm an autistic female human being. But the things that I'm describing could happen in anybody's life. With autism, it's to do with the intensity and the severity, and that's what the people that diagnose, the clinicians, are going to be looking at. They're going to be looking at the intensity and the severity over time of those traits, of those behaviours, because something like sensory needs, it's not about having a preference to not be in bright light. It's about bright light can be physically painful and completely alarming to an autistic person. Or it's not about weak proprioception, meaning that we have a preference to move around and connect and touch and feel our environment. It's about actually we can be very undersensitive in that area, and for us to feel connected and know where we are in position to our environment and to be able to feel comfortable and relax, we need to gauge where we are first through looking, touching, feeling, all of that stuff. So masking. Boys mask too, right? And actually, all human beings to a certain extent may mask. Most of us have a telephone voice, don't we? If we have to like pick up the phone and speak to whoever, we tend to have a telephone voice. It just happens. The thing with autistic girls is that we are much more inclined to mask because the demand on us in terms of the female social world is much higher. So if you think about boys tend to talk about what they like doing. They tend to engage on stuff, whether that is playing a sport or online computer gaming, or like the Warcraft modeling thing that some boys like to do with all the little figures and you paint them and you have battles. They tend to engage over an activity, a thing, a shared interest, and that's what they talk about. And they don't tend to talk about how are you feeling or what do you want to be when you grow up, or it's much more task focused or practical, or almost a bit transactional for male autistics when they're socializing. In the female social world, there's a much higher expectation to share your feelings, to know all of that small talk about, my dad did this and my mum did that, and I really fancy the boy on the bus. They do talk about relationships. They do talk about boys really early on. And therefore, for a female autistic individual, that can feel really, really overwhelming. I can clearly remember starting secondary school, and I was super, super naive. Often autistic people do seem younger than they are. And I was really naive, and I would hear girls talking about things they got up to with boys, and I literally did not have a clue what they were going on about. And I would just sit there aghast, like, trying to figure out in my head, what does that look like? What does that mean? I mean, I didn't even kiss a boy until I was 15. And when he tried to kiss me in the way that grown-ups kiss, I was horrified, so grossed out. No one told me that was going to happen. And I think I am quite typical of a lot of female autistic people in that respect, that whole world feels really complex to us. And so we have two choices, right? We can either just be really invisible, so we sit on the periphery of these groups and we listen and we watch and we try and learn, but we don't speak up or try and share experiences. Or the autistic female will mask, and she will adopt the dress and the makeup and the language of her peers. She will hang out with the people that they hang out with in the places that they hang out, and she may potentially be exposed to participating in activities that are not necessarily good for her too early on. So things like experimenting with alcohol and drugs and intimate relationships. Autistic females are much more likely to feel pressured to do what their friends are doing, because they want to be liked and they want to be accepted, and they usually don't like being on the outside of all of that. The impact of this masking, this just mirroring and going along with what other typical girls do, has significant long-term repercussions for your mental health. Because if you go through life trying to be like everybody else and just focusing on how other people talk and how they look and how they move, how they walk, what they're interested in, it means that you completely underestimate your own needs. When I finally got my diagnosis at 42, I really had to learn about what lifestyle changes I needed to make to support my needs. And I did make some tough decisions about not socializing in big groups anymore and carving out time for me to be alone, because I really need to be alone on a regular basis. Not for, like, I'm not talking about days on end or even hours on end, but you know, I often go to bed later than the rest of my family just to have that 1 or 2 hours at the end of the day of silence with no demands being placed on me, just doing what I want to do for me. And that has huge mental health benefits. But if you are just going along with the crowd, you completely don't recognize or do things that support your own needs. Also, that's where the identity confusion comes in, because it becomes really blurry, like, what do I like doing versus what am I doing because everybody else is doing it? Like, I can click, I love music, right? I love listening to music. I love singing. I've got a terrible singing voice. But when I was younger, the group of girls that I hung out with, they were like cool sort of rocker chick type girls, and they really liked the Black Rose and Guns N' Roses. And I used to go to concerts, Brixton Academy and Wembley Stadium, and it was exciting and I did like the music, but the actual experience of traveling to these venues and then being shoulder to shoulder with all of these strangers, and it's so loud and sweaty and it's long, it's so dragged out, it was kind of torture for me, and I definitely wouldn't say it again now, but it's what my friends are doing, so it's what I did. I didn't stop to think about, actually, is this what I really want to do? The important thing to say about masking as well is that it's not a conscious act, or very rarely anyway. It's something that you just instinctively do to fit in. My husband, before I got diagnosed, he used to tease me and say that there was lots of different Lizzys. And he'd say that I was one Lizzy with my birth family and another Lizzy at work when he'd hear me at work or on the phone in meetings. And then I'd be another Lizzy when I was with just him, and another Lizzy with the children that's just a big silly kid and likes mucking about with the boys. And I did used to take that quite personally and feel like, I don't know, to me it felt like a criticism of my character. Like, am I being fake? Am I choosing to be a different person in all of those settings? And then when I got my autism diagnosis, I recognized that I was just adapting to meet expectations of what I felt those people needed from me. I would adapt to be the best version of me in that situation for the audience. And so it's not like a conniving thing. You just want to fit in and you want to serve and you want to do what you're meant to do. I've said already that in your vulnerable teenage years, this can be quite damaging. And the other thing is that masking is so exhausting. It drains your social energy like nothing else. And actually, masking is a major contributor to meltdowns when you lose behavioural control and freak out. And that may be screaming, shouting, crying, hitting, destroying things, hurting yourself, or shutdowns when we just completely shut off, closing on ourselves. We don't want to talk, we don't want to be touched, we don't want to go anywhere, just want to be on our own, maybe engaging with our special interest, but a barrier goes up. And those will be the two things that you may often see in your autistic females, and they're tricky to support, and they can feel really upsetting and personal to you as parent carers. And we do a brilliant course actually for Mind. Aspie Trainers run a brilliant meltdowns and shutdowns course just focusing on these specific areas that I'd really recommend, so that you can better support meltdowns and shutdowns, because the parent carers often describe this as the most tricky part of the autism. And so I think if you want to think about where you can have the most impact in terms of supporting your autistic females, this is a really core area. That said, you can't stop meltdowns and shutdowns. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of our still with our emotional regulation and the way that we react. What you can do is help us recognize our triggers and have some coping strategies and some like an action plan of what to do next if we find ourselves in that situation. So thinking then about how to empower and support autistic girls, what I'm going to share with you now is a couple of slides that are based on my experience and from all of the parents and carers that I've met over the last 3 years training about autism, what I think could really help autistic females. So the first thing is to recognise their anxiety. And by that, I mean, understand what is it that they're really worried or fearful about. Anxiety represents in different ways. So what we tend to see as anxiety is like worrying, fretting, being nervous about something. But actually, anxiety can also cause a person to be very irritable or appear very angry. And that is their anxiety coming out. They're irritable because inside they're feeling nervous and worried and stressed. And what comes out in them in particular is irritation and anger. So first of all, you need to understand what it is that's kind of triggering them, and then try and help them solve it. So often we fall into the trap of saying, don't worry about that, or don't be silly, that, you know, we're being kind, but we're thinking, don't worry, or no, people won't think that. No, you don't have to worry about that. It's okay, honestly, I promise you. And the thing is, that's not going to make the autistic person feel better. When I was growing up, I had a major paranoia about the thought of getting my homework in late or getting a detention. I hated getting things wrong, and the thought of getting in trouble was literally like terrifying to me. I wanted to be seen as like smart and popular and fitting in. And if somebody had recognised that anxiety in me, they may have helped me develop my executive functioning skills so that I could plan and organise my homework in such a way that I didn't reach a bottleneck. So a way to have recognising that anxiety in me would have been someone sitting down with me and saying, okay, let's look at your in my day it was called the contact book. I don't know what you would call it nowadays. I think it's probably online, the homework, but let's look at what a typical week looks like, and then let's try and build some skills in around prioritising and breaking that down and spreading it through the week, so that, as I say, you don't hit a bottleneck and then don't potentially risk not meeting a deadline. Most autistic girls will, like their peers, get interested in makeup and fashion and social media and celebrity. And I think you could play a role as parent carer in helping them get that right and being a sounding board and giving them advice on the nuances of their friends' conversations around these topics. I never had that kind of guidance, and I made some horrendous mistakes when I was at high school. I can remember listening to, when I started getting spots and stuff, and listening to other girls talk about foundation and cover up, and I did not have a clue what they were going on about. And at the time, my mum worked as an Avon lady, so I raided her Avon box, and I literally got a number of pale, glittery eyeshadows, and with the little sponge applicator, like dabbed it on my spots, thinking that I was covering them up. Went to school feeling so like empowered, and yeah, you know, I wonder what people are going to think, that I've actually covered up my spots. And then, of course, all that happened was that I got mercilessly teased, because in effect I had glittery forehead from these eyeshadows that didn't mask my spots at all. They just drew attention to them, if anything. You know, you need to give your autistic female the support to understand things like skincare routines. If they're suffering really badly with spots, instead of them feeling embarrassed and ugly, helping them look after their skin, taking them to the doctors if it is significant enough to potentially warrant some medication for acne, not letting them suffer in silence unnecessarily, helping them understand about fashion and dress appropriately, I think is a really important thing. Do also talk to them about their social skills and about friendships, because often some autistic people don't need or want a lot of close human relationships. I get my like sort of real love and satisfaction from being with my husband and children. That to me is the most important thing. And then outside of that, my husband's family, and I have a few really close long-term friends, but I don't have a strong need for friendship outside of my family, and I don't have a need to socialize outside of my family. But lots of autistic people do, and they do want that, but they don't necessarily know how to make it work. So having those little coaching conversations like I have with my youngest Henry about what friendship looks like and what makes a good friend. One of the things that Leo loves doing when he gets in from school is he does online gaming with like Roblox with his friends. But then say his friend suddenly says, oh, I've got to go and have my dinner now. In the past, Leo would have just gone and like quit the game. Not to be rude, but because, okay, he's got to go and have his dinner, so I'll end the game. No, like, bye, see you tomorrow, that was fun, thank you. So it's intervening and making sure that they are treating their friends rightly and kindly and considerately, whilst at the same time making sure that they're not being taken advantage of, because you have to consider whether all friendships are healthy friendships and whether they're friends with people that actually support and consider them, or whether they're just being used as a dog's body. I've talked about journaling being really cathartic, so that is definitely something that I would encourage you to do with them. On the next slide, don't fall into the trap of thinking they're okay because they act okay or they tell you they're fine. What you need to do is really force yourself to take a holistic snapshot of their whole life. So look at their grooming. Are they showering regularly? Are they taking care of their appearance? How well are they eating? Do they eat with you as a family? Are they secretly overeating away from you, or are they not eating, so saying they're going to eat in their room and then chucking the food away? What's their sleep patterns like? Do they have a routine of getting to bed by X time and getting up at X time, so that they have a good routine and pattern? Or do you see a light under their door at 2 o'clock in the morning when you get up to use the loo because they're still on social media? Do they take regular exercise? So a lot of people equate exercise as meaning that you're on some sort of mission to lose weight, but everybody knows that exercise creates endorphins, creates happy mood, good, you know, a natural high, and therefore exercise is critical for all young people. But in particular, our autistic females who tend to have low self-esteem and be vulnerable to mental health problems, it doesn't have to be the traditional things that you think of. I like we've got a trampoline in our garden, which the boys love using. They love running to the seafront. We do quite a lot of like classes online on YouTube. So during the first lockdown, actually, we had so much fun. We found body combat, which is like fighting to music. And like me and the two boys did it religiously. We absolutely loved it. So it's finding something that suits them and is comfortable for them, and it doesn't have to be high intensity. It could be going up on the downs to walk the dog, or doing some gentle laps at your local swimming baths when that reopens. But just fresh air and being out and connecting with nature is really, really important. Also think about, do they need help with study techniques? Because, and this comes on to the next point, executive dysfunction will increasingly become a problem as your young females move up through the school levels and are required to study and travel and communicate more independently. Your executive function, or our executive function, is that part of our brain that helps us plan and organise and prioritise. It helps us manage our time, and it helps us start tasks to be that kind of motivation. It also helps us regulate our emotions. Now, in autistic people, this area is often underdeveloped, and we find it particularly difficult, and it can be the most disabling part of autism for a lot of us. So teaching your young autistic person early on to use things like reminders and calendars in their phone, or to use breathing exercises and techniques to calm when they're feeling really stressed. Those are kind of lifelong lessons that I wish somebody had taught me, and that I make a lot of effort to share with my children, because I want them to learn those kind of good basic self-regulation practices early on. I mentioned about my need for private time. Your autistic female is very likely to be the same, particularly when she's coming home from school or college, and where she's been kind of very exposed to lots of people, different competing voices, the smells, and pushing and shoving in the corridor when you're trying to get to the next lesson. When they get home, they will feel really drained and may just want to go and sit in their room, and whether they go and read a magazine or are using social media, they need that quiet alone time. Sometimes as parents, we can fall into that trap of saying, oh, they're being a typical teenager, going up to their room, not engaging with the family. I think that can be very polarizing and feel quite judgmental for the autistic young female. So I think it's about a balance. It's about having some ground rules in your family, that if you like everybody to eat together, even if there's only particular days of the week that everyone is home at the same time, that you can all eat together, that you have that, but you're also respectful of when she needs her time alone to recharge or to follow through on her special interests. And you do also need to be quite open and honest about tricky subjects. So things like dating, drinking, intimacy, we're going to get to come into contact with those things somehow, aren't we? Whether that is through programs on the telly, or stuff that we read, or through social media, or through our peers. I think it's important that those subjects aren't made to be felt like they're embarrassing, because I think it's when and again, sometimes parents, they think they're being kind, or maybe they think they're being funny, but they will joke about these things and tease, and they think it's harmless, but actually to an autistic person, it can really undermine and minimize our feelings, and mean that we don't trust you enough to have an open conversation with you. So if you want them to be able to confide in you, then there needs to be kind of quite sound, non-judgmental, open conversations, and let them guide it, because some of them, like my oldest, is really interested in puberty. We've got the Usborne do some brilliant books, actually. They do a boys one and a girls one, about approaching puberty, and because of the way I've brought him up, he's not embarrassed about it. He's really interested, and it's lovely. It's so refreshing. But if you do have an autistic female who is more guarded, more awkward, then maybe it's a case of giving the book to her and letting her go off with it, and then telling her to come and ask you any questions. And being honest about your experience of puberty, what you found tricky. I think the more you can open yourself up and say what you experienced, then they might be willing to share back. So finding friends thing, it's really interesting because you would imagine, especially when they get to high school, they're exposed to so many different types of people. You would think that they would be able to make at least one or two friends. But the thing about autistic friendships is that, and I mean a real meaningful friendship where there's trust and it's mutually beneficial, we need to feel safe to be our true selves. And I think one of the best ways to connect with an autistic person is through their special interest, because our special interests or you probably would more call them hobbies, but it's not just a hobby. It's not just about something we like doing. It's about something that completely absorbs us, that it makes our heart beat faster, that it fills us with such a passion and enthusiasm. And when we're engaging in that special interest, it just takes over. And if you can find ways for them to meet people passionate about the same subject, then that is a great way to make friends. Obviously, some special interests can be more mainstream than others. One of the really good things that my son's middle school did is, because of his passion for Transformers, they introduced in year 3, I think it was, an after school Transformers club, and other kids that were interested in the toys and the movie franchise would come along, and they'd all look at each other Transformers and talk about it. And he made some really cool not necessarily deep lifelong friendships, but some really good associations. And now, because he takes the Transformer to school with him every day, which he's allowed to do because it helps with his anxiety, and also as a fiddle toy to keep him like staying seated at the desk, he has loads of people approaching now asking, oh, what one have you brought in today, and can you show me how it transforms, and can I have a look? And that was such a brilliant thing that the school did for him to help connect him with other people that he could engage with at that level. And that's where you will see the true like spirit of who he is. It's where he will really become alive and be really passionate and be at his most confident when he's talking about his special interest. Do pay attention to your young female's mental health needs. If you can know what triggers a meltdown or a shutdown in her, then you can talk about, you're never going to be able to stop them happening, but what you can do is reduce, sometimes remove triggers, but it's more reduce and minimize and provide a safe way of coming out the other side of a meltdown. And if you're worried about their mental health, then talk to them about it, and don't be afraid to seek support from relevant professionals. I mean, my oldest is just about to become 10, and both my boys have EHCPs, and it is exhausting being a parent of a child with additional needs. In terms of actually engaging support for them in their education, is so exhausting. It's such a battle. It's a fight. It's exhausting. And there are days when I do have a good cry and I get so frustrated when people aren't listening. But all you need to find is one good professional that's on your side, whether that is a GP or a school nurse. It might be the Senko at school, or it might be a TA or a teaching assistant, or maybe it's the head if you're lucky. But if you can find one person that kind of gets it and that understands and listens and can provide influence with other people that maybe don't get it so well, it's good to find an ally. And even though it can often feel like them and us, and that the relationship with the school is a bit of a battle, you need to keep in your head that there needs to be that parent partnership. And I've had some horrendous clashes with the head teachers in my children's schools in the past, but we've worked really hard to rebuild those relationships and continue to try and provide the best school experience possible for my sons. So we don't, the fight is probably always going to be there, but it can be done in such a way that the school doesn't feel like the enemy. And actually the infant school that my youngest is at, the infant school that Leo went to as well, they're brilliant. And because they've been on Leo's journey with Henry, he's he had his EHCP before he even started school, because he went to nursery there. Very early on, they identified that he would benefit from portage, and they were already making adaptations as if he were autistic prior to any sort of diagnosis. So that's really, really positive. Finally, just really embrace their strengths. I think that there's an Autism Awareness Week every year, right? And I think actually most people are aware of autism. Like, if you said to somebody, oh, blah, blah, blah is autistic, they'd know that the autistic is a thing that exists. And they'd probably know that it's something to do with our brains and etc. But actually, there's really few people who properly understand what it means, and I've had all sorts of weird things said to me, people commiserating when I told them that my son's autistic, saying, in fact, I remember my mum saying, when my oldest son got diagnosed, I was really upset at the time because I didn't know anything about autism at all then, didn't know I was autistic, and I just thought his life is going to be so difficult. And I remember my mum saying, he will, some autistic people go on and get married, some autistic people go on and get jobs. And I remember thinking, why would he not get married and have a job? Like, he's amazing. Why would she think that? And she probably was just trying to help in her own way. But the fact is that autism comes with many gifts. Yes, it comes with many challenges and struggles, but those struggles often aren't really to do with the autism itself. It's more to do with how we integrate into a world that's majority neurotypical. Because our education systems and our workplaces and our shopping centres, everything's geared towards neurotypical individuals. And so as autistic individuals, yes, we do find lots of day-to-day things that you might take for granted really tough, because we're being forced to exist in an environment that isn't tailored to our needs. But we also have lots of gifts. We are we're very caring, motivated, ambitious people. We can be really, really creative. Our ability to hyper-focus means that we become masters of our special interests, and that if we're focusing on a particular task, we give it 150, 200%, because we are real perfectionists. And we can be funny. We're really engaging. We when we're really passionate about something, like a topic, whether that was animal welfare or caring for the elderly, like when we're passionate about something, we're really good at fighting for that cause and demonstrating real kind of energy and commitment to a cause. I've included in the slides some resources that I think are really kind of useful follow-up. So the first one is a magazine called Spectrum Women. This is a magazine that's based out of Australia, but they regularly have international contributors. And what's really good about Spectrum Women is it genuinely encompasses gender diversity. So regardless of how an individual identifies in terms of their gender, they will find this content accessible and really kind of accepting, inclusive. So they have a range of different stuff. They have features, interviews. They talk about topical interests. So talk about relationships or parenting or about well-being. And it's just really, really nice because you can browse through and it might lead you to looking at stuff on YouTube or reading about some new research that has been done. But I personally find it really interesting. I would say that the topic is not risky in any way. It's not that anything is not appropriate for particular ages. But what I would say is that I would imagine it's like 14, 15 upwards that could read this independently. Younger than that, they may find some of the topics interesting, but I think it would be more about looking through it together and maybe watching some of the videos or reading some of the articles from autistic authors that they might find more interesting, but doing it in partnership with you, so you're exploring it together. Now the next few slides are resources that have all been compiled by the University of Kent. They've done a really good job on their website of pulling together a cohesive range of support tools. So starting with the National Autistic Society, who offer specific learning around gender and autism, or women and autism and girls. Then there are different organisations that you can connect with. So that Limpsfield Grange is a school that's really, really interesting, looking at their specialist school for girls with autism. The Samantha Craft's unofficial checklist for autistic women, that was one of the first things that I did when I was learning everything about autism to support Leo, and suddenly the penny dropped and I was like, oh my God, I think that's what, that's who I am as well. And I Googled, am I autistic? And Samantha's checklist came up, and actually I found it really, really useful. It's unofficial because it's more biased towards females. It describes much more of the female typical characteristics that you would see, but it helps you think about whether it's worthy of reaching out to your local GP and having a conversation about accessing diagnostic services. There's also a number of books about autism, but more importantly, by autistics for autistics. So some of those are more fact-based or autobiographical. Some are fictional, but all worthy, I think, of a look. And only you can know really what will work for your autistic female. I think look at the links in the slides, research, and you pick out. It's like when I first had to tell my older son that he was autistic, I bought loads and loads of books off Amazon about autism, way too many actually, but it was because none of the books perfectly matched who he was as in his unique presentation of autism. So it was about trying to find books that I felt would appeal to him. And actually one of the ones he liked best, I can't remember the exact name, but it was about a little boy called Ethan, and it was written by an autistic 8-year-old. I think he's a teen now, but at the time he wrote the book with his parents and his dad illustrated it. And because Leo loves writing books, he, that really made him feel really excited, the fact that this book is being written by a real autistic person who's also an aspiring author. He really, really liked that. And then you've got a number of projects there, research projects that are running live at Kent University to enable people to participate, give feedback, really dependent on you, but they're not exclusively projects just for their University of Kent students. There are projects that as members of the public you can contribute to if you're interested. And then they've included some links to recent books and articles on autism and gender, because this whole thing around male versus female and gender dysphoria is still very new, and we still don't really understand what explains the gender variations, but there is some interesting topics to read there. Going on to some further reading just on the last slide there. So finally, before we look at questions, just a few closing comments. That there's no one behaviour that reliably identifies autism. It really is about, a spectrum is not a bell curve or a continuum with low functioning at this end and high function at the other end. The autistic spectrum is like a wheel or a pie. You've got the person in the middle, and then around the outside, you've got all of the different traits. So social communication and social interaction, meltdowns and shutdowns, executive functioning, anxiety or other mental health conditions, flexibility of thought, rigid restrictive behaviours, special interests. You've got all of this stuff around the outside. And then depending on the individual, if you imagine like a scale, the spokes of the wheel or the slices of the pie going out, some people will be very high need in some areas and they'll be low need in other areas, and their level of need may change over time depending on the support that's available to them. But when you're talking about an autistic individual, you're talking about variable high and low needs against so many different characteristics. So you really need to look at the full spectrum to get an idea of whether your autistic young person is autistic, because it is, as you see on the slide there, it's a hidden or invisible condition. We don't look a certain way, We don't have a stamp on the back of our necks saying made in autism land. So you need to dig really effectively and keep notes over time. If you see behaviours demonstrated that you think are suggestive of autism, jot it down in a notebook, because you want to see over a period of several months that there's patterns and consistency and that intensity that would suggest it is autism. Remember that it's varied for all individuals. So gender has one impact on how our autism is expressed, but it's one tiny part of that overall expression. And then just never assume anything. Become your own expert in the subject, accessing resources, whether that's online or through parent support groups or written literature and materials that you buy. Become your own expert so that you can have a credible conversation with the professionals, because the more credible you appear, the more likely they are to listen. And keep an open mind, because autism comes with a lot of associated comorbidities. In other words, conditions that occur alongside autism. Physical conditions like poor digestive problems and sleep disorders, alongside other neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia. So it's why you need to keep an open mind. Before we close with some questions that we've had on this course in the past, I did want to draw your attention here to the feedback link. If you go on to, if you have a QR code reader on your phone, then you can just scan the code. Or if you see the link there, westsussexmind.org/online-training-evaluation-form. This takes you through to the Mind digital survey. It's a very short survey, but actually, even though you haven't participated in a group course today, Mind still really need to hear your feedback. They need to know if this training was worthwhile, and actually as if it's worth them investing on this type of program for the future, because their training offer evolves and varies all the time. At the moment, for example, they're doing a lot of training on autism for professionals, which I've been involved with. Last year, they had a huge parent carer autism training program with lots of different providers offering different topics. So that they can know where best to spend their money and their budget, it really helps to get your feedback. So you don't have to do that right now unless you want to. You can do it while you're listening to me talk through the questions. But otherwise, do request a copy of the training slides from Mind, and the link to the feedback evaluation will be in there. So this is a question that we had actually on a course fairly recently. And somebody was telling us that she's going to be leading a girls group for autistic girls in particular. And she asked what we would recommend to help make the group beneficial for them and comfortable for them. So this, first of all, was quite refreshing to hear, because whilst there are a number of self-advocacy groups that exist for older autistic girls and adults, actually there really isn't, there's very little in terms of bringing autistic adolescents together. So it's really good to hear that this was occurring. The type of things that we talked about, for example, is that in the first instance, you have to want the autistic girl to go there. I mean, at the minute, it would all be over Zoom anyway, but ultimately, post-COVID, we'd like to imagine that we can get people physically together. So you need to think about how to make that an attractive prospect, particularly given that some autistic girls will really not enjoy group settings and actually may much more prefer to engage over Zoom. But first and foremost, it's about making sure they know where they're going, how they're going to get there, and what it's going to look like when they get there. So any information you can provide up front about the venue, the journey, transport options, timings, provide a photograph of the person that's going to be leading the group, because that makes it real and tangible and meaningful. Then you need to think about content, and people are always going to be more engaged if they have a bit of control over the content. So I guess the first session is going to have to be composed and led by the person running the group. But some of the things that I'd be wanting to do very early on is, first of all, working with the autistic girls to come up with some type of ground rules for the group, which I think everybody would benefit from. And I say that because autistic people tend to be really quite open and direct, sometimes to the point that it could be considered rude. Over the years, I've found that my style of communication, being very direct and open, is quite polarizing, because some people will say that they really love my integrity and directness, and they find it really refreshing, and other people will say they find it really rude and a bit intimidating. So I think it's about agreeing with the girls what sort of ground rules do they want to have in place so that everybody feels comfortable, and everybody's trying to behave in a supportive, respectful manner. And then in terms of content, it's like, have a brainstorm. What are the stuff that's really topical to them? What do they really, really want to talk about? What's bothering them at school at the moment or in the world at the moment? And I think any sort of agenda or topic needs to be pared down. So what I don't think an autistic girls group would want to see is a really detailed minute by minute agenda for every meeting. I think that would be really, if I was running these type of groups, I would have one topic each week of discussion. So it could be that we're discussing how autistic people are portrayed in the media. It's just something that we've recognised there's lots more people in the media at the moment, autistic characters in films and movies. Let's have a chat about that and what do they think of it. Or it could be about makeup or fashion and somebody coming in and doing a demonstration for them. And then the other thing that I thought would be really nice is, because our special interests are a way to really like engage us and bring out our true selves, our personality, our characters, that each week you could have an opportunity for one person to talk for 10 minutes about their special interest. It doesn't have to be 10 minutes, I just pulled that number out of thin air. But I think it's really engaging and interesting to hear about other people's special interests, but also it's really empowering and is an opportunity for them to really connect with their audience by sharing this, whatever it is that they're really, really passionate about. So that's the kind of stuff that I would have there for the group. Yeah. Okay. So this question, I have an 11-year-old daughter diagnosed with high functioning autism in the past 2 years. She really doesn't want to talk about her diagnosis. While she accepts it, she doesn't want any help or support, but she's finding it hard at school and to regulate her emotions. We have lots of intense anger and meltdowns at home. What advice could you give on finding ways to support her, which she might accept? Now, this for me, first and foremost, felt like the priority needs to be helping the 11-year-old daughter embrace her diagnosis. The parent says that she accepts it, but the fact that the young lady doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to confide in teachers or peers, friends, suggests that she's got some, she's feeling self-conscious or embarrassed, or maybe sees it as a real negative. And I think it's so important that every person that's diagnosed with autism can understand the good stuff and the benefits. And I'm lucky because my children have both been diagnosed really young. To them, it was just like, oh, okay. And it's been a learning curve, and we continue to learn about it all together all the time. And they haven't ever felt uncomfortable about it, because it's just who we are and how we live. When you've particularly got a teenage girl or boy that discovers they're neurodiverse, it can be much harder for them to feel comfortable with the diagnosis and what that really means for them. So I think a bit of work needs to be done, talking with her about what it means and what it doesn't mean, and what the positives are, and where she struggles, why she struggles. Because more often than not, why the individual is struggling is not the fact they're autistic. it's that because their needs are a bit different, and school or college is set up to meet people's needs according to neurotypical individuals, that's creating the stressor. It's not actually the being autistic that's the problem, it's the environment that's the problem. And so what you can do is start to educate school with some really specific examples of what would make this young person's life a bit easier at school, so that she's not coming home and kind of taking all her frustration out on her family. But I do think that first and foremost, it is about getting her to be comfortable with her diagnosis, and then starting small, encouraging her to confide in with just maybe one teacher or one of her closest friends, and hoping that that goes well and is responded to appropriately, that then she can start to be more open about sharing that diagnosis. And actually, you don't even have to talk about it as a diagnosis, because unfortunately, because of the way that autism is diagnosed in our country, it's very medicalized, and it is described as a disorder, as a problem, which it really, hello, it's my cat Ellie, it really doesn't have to be. So it's quite nice to talk about it as a discovery, that you've discovered she's autistic, that she has this different brain, this different wiring, that actually is one of the things that makes her so brilliant. But also it means that at school she needs certain adjustments, so more regular breaks or a bit of flexibility around start and finish times, for example. This comes on to a question we've had where it says, how do I get my autistic daughter's school to help make adjustments to her day so that she doesn't get overloaded and come home and have huge meltdowns? This is really interesting because we hear this from parents and carers a lot, where the school is saying they're a model student, you know, they're fine, they smile at school and they seem happy. And then the parents are saying, well, she's coming home and she's having these huge meltdowns and, you know, being really aggressive, or she's starving herself, or she's self-harming, or she's crying every morning and saying she doesn't want to go to school, even though when she gets there she appears fine. So I think here the parent has to be really, really proactive. When schools say that she appears fine, you know, they can't see anything wrong, they're just saying what they genuinely think. And it just is a sign that the autistic female is masking really effectively. So as parents, we need to change the dialogue. And instead of saying, what can you do to stop her coming home and being completely overloaded and having a meltdown, it's about you having a think about, what do you think and what does your daughter think would make school less stressful? And I've had exactly these conversations with my kids. And some of the things that we've come up with is stuff like, for example, for my very active sensory seeker, he needs more regular exercise breaks. When he's got all of this energy fizzing around in his body and he's under kind of under sensitive proprioception, making him want to grab and touch and run around and leap everywhere, he needs to have more regular exercise breaks, just a couple of minutes of intense physical activity between subjects, which then means he's better able to focus in the lesson. Now that he's older, so that was kind of very typical in primary school. Now that he's at middle school, instead, what he does is he has a transformer on his desk so that he can fiddle with that and be manipulating that to keep his hands busy, which then helps his brain to focus. The other thing is that he's got really good at self-regulating. So when he just feels like, oh, I've had enough, he'll just say that he needs to go to the toilet. And I remember a year or so ago having a bit of a debate with his English teacher because she said he goes to the toilet too much. And I said, if he's going to the toilet a lot, it's because he's feeling overloaded in your subject and he's needing time out. And then he's coming back and he's still doing the work. And they were able to accept it then because they saw it as him like skiving off, but it wasn't. It was just a subject he finds trickier, therefore felt more intense. Therefore, he could only stomach it in smaller chunks, not just for, you know, one huge lesson. Other things, when they need a safe place to be able to retreat to. So when they were younger, so Henry's still at infant school, he has a tent so that if he's feeling a bit overloaded, or he's trying to ward off a meltdown, or he's had a cracking meltdown and he just needs to be calm and away from everyone to recover, then he's got a tent just outside the classroom that he can go and sit in. All of his like sensory and fiddle toys are in there, and books that he likes to read, and comfy bean bags and stuff, so that he can just relax and calm down. And then things like having a bit of flexibility around start and finish times. The start and end of the school day, I think, irrespective of the school, and like my youngest one's infant school is only 2 form entry, but it's still a bun fight. Like all of the parents and all of the kids in the playground, even in this land of COVID with everybody masked up and 2 meters distance, it's still very busy and intense. So having some variation around either letting them come in 5 minutes early or 5 minutes after everybody else has arrived, or if they really hate being late, could they come in a different entrance like the school office and then get brought down to the classroom when everybody else is sitting down? So it's thinking about that sort of thing. Potentially once they're at high school, it could also mean allowing a bit more transition time between lessons, because often the timetable is so fast paced at high school, and we've got these huge buildings and people trying to navigate from A to B to Z, and it can be quite stressful and intense for the young autistic student. So knowing that they have a little bit of leeway on when they arrive and that the teacher's not going to make a fuss, or letting them leave each lesson a few minutes early so they can get to the next lesson a few minutes early without having to be in the corridor with the busy throng. All of those little things actually over the course of a day can really make a difference to how overloaded your autistic female is. Now, obviously, older girls aren't going to want to be going into a tent, but she may want permission to be able to go off into a shared area, or between classrooms, or the library, or maybe there's a drama or PE studio that's not in use all the time, just somewhere where she can go and have 10 minutes time out and breathe and space and quiet, and then go back and engage. Finally, for today, we had a question around how to open the conversation for the first time about autism with a young autistic person, especially if they're not officially diagnosed. So I think this has to be a bit of a drip feed, because I mean, they're going to be more receptive if they're younger anyway, because they won't have any preconceived ideas about autism. But I think in the first instance, we don't even use that language, and we have a conversation with the young person that talks about how they think and feel. And that just like people do come in all shapes and sizes and different coloured skin and eyes and different abilities, we also have different brains. And that shouldn't be a surprise, right? Because if everybody else can vary, why would our brains not vary? And that sometimes when our brain is different, it means that we communicate differently, or we experience senses like smell or sound or touch differently. And that can make life tricky for us. And talk to that young person about what's going on at school or college or at home at the moment and where they're struggling. And that potentially that's down to their brain being different. But at the same time, the things that they're fabulous at, that they're really good at, that make them special and fantastic and unique, are also down to the fact their brain is different. So I'll give you an example. When Leo was going through the diagnostic process, it took 2 years, and he was assessed for autism and ADHD. And I found it really hard that he was having to participate in these interviews and exercises, and people coming in and observing him at school, particularly at CAMS, having to talk about his mental health in front of him when he was so young, and talk about his really negative behaviours in front of him. I found that really uncomfortable. So to prepare him, I talk about the fact that he was angry all of the time when he was really young, when he was like 4 or 5, and the fact that he hurt people a lot. And I said, I know you don't want to be like that, and I know you don't really understand why it's happening, and neither do mummy and daddy, but these people are trying to help us understand why you get angry, because we think your brain might be different. But if your brain is different, that also explains why you're such a brilliant artist and why you're amazing at coming up with ideas for stories. and why you've got so much energy that from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed, you're talking and laughing and encouraging everybody else to do stuff because you've got this amazing brain. And I think once you've started to have those conversations and just broach the idea that a brain is can be different, then you can maybe start to watch some programs on TV. So for younger children, Sesame Street has an autistic character now, Julia, or there's a lovely cartoon on YouTube, an animation called Amazing Things Happen, which is a lovely animation that talks about generally people's differences and therefore what difference might look like for somebody with a different brain. Then in terms of like, as they're getting older, more teenagers, programs on telly, they are a bit more stereotyped when they're older, but things like The Good Doctor or The A Word, at least it's a starting place. What I find brilliant, and I always recommend, is on YouTube, there's a real range of diverse video logs, people with their own channels talking about what it's like to be autistic. And I would say, do this exercise separately. Don't try and find people with your young person. You go and do the legwork, because depending on who they are, there's a real range of like males and females, different age groups, different ethnic backgrounds. There's one lady who I really like following who's an autistic mum, and she's got 5 autistic kids, and she does a video log. You need to think about and find individuals that are going to inspire and be relatable to your young person, and only you know what's going to work for them. But trust me, they will be out there, and you need to go through and search and watch some of these blogs. But the one that I love for young autistic girls is called Princess Aspie. She's a young girl called Chloe. I think she's Australian as well, actually. And Chloe's in her early 20s now, but she started her video log in her teens. And I mean, she's got hundreds of videos on YouTube. She covers every conceivable topic. She's so engaging. She's funny. She's very like creative and colourful, and in the way that she looks. So she she's visually appealing. She's a character. She's not just none of her videos are boring or dull. They're really engaging and insightful, and personal examples of what she's experienced growing up as an autistic young woman. And she's a fantastic person to get your young female watching, and for you to watch alongside and learn with her. And then of course there's loads of books. The Girl with the Curly Hair is the name of a social enterprise run by Alice Rowe, who's an autistic individual, and she does some amazing books with like cartoon stickmen type animations, if that's the right word, or illustrations. But she now does books for boys and girls, but initially she did a lot of stuff around autism and girls. But her website is really good. You can subscribe to get more access to more interesting content, but she has a lot of like books and videos and stuff that are accessible. So it's just really looking at what type of media would appeal to your young person, and then digging around and researching. And even better, if you can find her a buddy, so talk to school. If there's another autistic girl, ideally a year or 2 or 3 older, who might be willing to act as an informal mentor. I actually do that in my free time for young autistic girls that I know in our local community. And I think it's a brilliant way for young people to have another real autistic person to aspire to and look up to and to ask questions of. So that's another thing that I think will help. But you don't have to rush into the language of autism straight away. Talk about it in the context of neurodiversity and having a different brain. And I think that you will find that over time, you'll be able to help your young autistic females really embrace their individuality as an autistic person. Thank you for your time.